Mina's palm flattened against nothingness. She had been stumbling through the Maryland forest for hours, soaked by a sudden storm, her grandfather's tattered map disintegrating in her hands. She reached out to steady herself against what looked like the rough bark of an oak, and her hand stopped cold against a surface that was smooth as ice and solid as steel. The forest seemed to inhale. From deep within the earth beneath her boots came a sound like heavy stones grinding against one another, a mechanical groan that vibrated up through her spine. Mina froze, her breath fogging against the invisible barrier. She wasn't touching a tree. She was touching a secret. But this moment, standing before a house that refused to be seen, was born 3 hours earlier, in a marble foyer where her family had gathered to remind her that she was worth nothing. Mina stood in the corner of the marble foyer, clutching a lukewarm glass of water while her siblings, Mark and Elena, basked in the glow of their father's extravagant generosity. It was their collective 40th birthday celebration, a milestone that should have felt like a new beginning, but for Mina, it felt like a final confirmation of her status as the family's afterthought. While Mark unwrapped the keys to a sleek Italian sports car and Elena wept over the deed to a beachfront villa, Mina was handed a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a rusted iron key, pitted with age, and a muddy, hand-drawn map on tattered parchment. The laughter from her siblings was immediate and sharp. They mocked the worthless inheritance from their late grandfather, a man they had spent years dismissing as senile and broken. But as Mina looked at the jagged lines on the map, she felt a strange pull. Little did they know, this key was a promise of a sanctuary that defied the laws of physics, hidden in a forest they had already surveyed and dismissed. Mina didn't stay for the cake. She couldn't. With the echoes of Elena's high-pitched giggles still ringing in her ears, she walked out to her dented sedan and drove away from the glittering estate. Tears blurred her vision as she navigated toward the remote coordinates scrawled on the back of the parchment. She was driving toward the edge of the Maryland wilderness, a place where the suburban sprawl finally gave up and surrendered to the ancient, towering pines. Her grandfather had always been different. While her father built glass towers in the city, the old man had whispered stories about eyes that see but do not perceive. She had thought it was just the rambling of a fading mind, but as the paved roads turned to gravel and the gravel turned to a narrow dirt track, the weight of the iron key in her pocket began to feel like a leaden anchor. The car could only go so far. Eventually, the undergrowth became too thick, a wall of green and brown that seemed to warn outsiders to stay away. Mina stepped out, the humid air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. She looked at the map. It didn't follow the established hiking trails or the fire roads carved out by the Forestry Service. Instead, it followed shadows and seasonal creeks. It was a set of instructions for someone who knew the land's pulse, not just its surface. She began to hike, her boots sinking into the soft loam. Every branch that scraped her arm felt like a reminder of her siblings' charity, the small checks they sent her just to keep her quiet, the way they looked at her thrift store clothes with a mixture of pity and disgust. She battled the urge to turn back. Why was she doing this? She was chasing a ghost in a forest that had been mapped 1,000 times by professionals. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to change. The birdsong grew quiet, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Then, the sky darkened. A sudden, violent Maryland storm broke through the canopy, turning the dry creek beds into rushing torrents within minutes. The trail, if there ever was one, simply vanished. Mina spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The trees all looked identical now, leaning in like spectators at a tragedy. She was disoriented, soaked to the bone, and the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. She clutched the map to her chest, protecting the ink from the rain. Was this her grandfather's final, cruel joke? Or was the map leading her to something that required her to lose herself before she could find the truth? The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the forest dripping and shrouded in a ghostly, low-hanging mist. Mina wiped the moisture from her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. According to the tattered map, she was standing exactly where she needed to be. But as she looked around the small clearing, her heart sank. There was nothing here but a dense thicket of mountain laurel and a few gnarled, ancient oaks. No cabin, no shelter, not even a ruin. She felt a surge of hot, bitter resentment. Her siblings were right. She was a fool, a girl chasing fairy tales in the mud while they sat in climate-controlled luxury. She turned to leave, her foot slipping on a mossy stone, and she reached out instinctively to steady herself against the trunk of a nearby tree. But her hand didn't meet the rough, forgiving texture of bark. Instead, it struck something cold, flat, and impossibly smooth. The impact sent a vibration up her arm that felt like a low-frequency hum. Mina froze, her fingers splayed against the air. She pulled her hand back and looked. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the dark pines and the grey sky. She reached out again, more slowly this time. Her palm flattened against a surface that was definitely solid, yet her eyes insisted she was looking through it into the woods beyond. She began to move sideways, her hands tracing the invisible barrier. As she shifted her perspective, the illusion flickered. From a certain angle, the sunlight caught the surface, revealing a faint, iridescent shimmer. It wasn't a tree at all. It was a wall of high-end, one-way mirrored glass, angled with such precision that it reflected the forest floor and the canopy in a perfect, seamless loop. The glass was interspersed with living walls, vertical tapestries of real moss, ferns, and lichen that thrived in the humidity, masking the sharp corners of the structure. This wasn't some senile old man's shack. This was a masterpiece of architectural camouflage, a building designed to hide in plain sight from tax assessors, satellite cameras, and greedy relatives. Her grandfather hadn't been losing his mind. He had been perfecting a vanishing act. The competitive tension she had felt all her life, the need to prove she wasn't the weak one, flared into a cold, focused fire. She realized the property hadn't been surveyed because it was designed to be unsurveyable. Mina followed the glass perimeter until she found a gnarled oak tree that seemed to grow directly out of the structure's side. She noticed a peculiar detail, a knot in the wood that looked too perfectly circular. She reached into the hollowed-out center, her fingers trembling as they brushed against a hidden metal plate. There, nestled deep within the wood, was a small, vertical slit. It was a keyhole. She pulled the rusted iron key from her pocket. It looked primitive and ugly against the high-tech elegance of the hidden house, a relic of a different era. But as she slid the iron teeth into the lock, she felt a series of heavy magnetic tumblers shifting deep within the earth. The tree didn't just stand there, it groaned with the sound of heavy machinery. The question that had driven her through the storm now intensified, pulse-like and insistent. What kind of secrets required a house that didn't want to be seen? What had her grandfather been protecting for 30 years, and why was she the only one he trusted to find the door? The rusted key turned with a heavy, satisfying thud that vibrated through the soles of Mina's boots. It wasn't the sound of a simple latch clicking open. It was the sound of a vault being unsealed. As the mechanism finished its rotation, a vertical seam appeared in the bark of the ancient oak. The tree didn't splinter or crack. Instead, a massive section of the trunk, reinforced with hidden steel, swung outward on silent, heavy-duty hinges. Behind it sat a reinforced door of brushed titanium, cold and imposing. Mina stepped over the threshold and the air changed instantly. The humid, heavy scent of the Maryland forest vanished, replaced by a crisp, climate-controlled stillness. It smelled of cedar, old parchment, and the distinct, ozone-like tang of high-end electronics. As the door hissed shut behind her, soft amber lights flickered to life along the baseboards. Mina stood in a wide, open living space that defied everything she knew about her grandfather's final years. The temperature was a constant, perfect 68 degrees. She realized the cabin was preserved in a vacuum-like state, protected from the decay of the outside world. To her left, a wall of glass, invisible from the outside, offered a panoramic view of the forest she had just struggled through. From here, the woods looked like a masterpiece in a gallery, silent and beautiful. She walked further into the room, her footsteps muffled by thick, hand-woven rugs. The cabin was a marvel of self-sustaining engineering. She saw a digital display on the wall showing the status of a hidden geothermal loop and a silent solar array. Her grandfather had disguised the panels as a jagged rock face on the southern ridge, ensuring the house had power without ever appearing on a thermal scan. The engineering was decades ahead of its time, a silent middle finger to the world that thought he had lost his edge. In the center of the room sat a massive mahogany desk, polished to a mirror shine. Laid out on its surface, as if he had just stepped away to brew a cup of tea, were several leather-bound journals and a pair of reading glasses. Mina approached the desk with a sense of reverence. She opened the top journal, the spine crackling in the silence. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, disciplined, and full of the fire her father had claimed was gone. The journals didn't contain the ramblings of a senile man. They were a meticulous record of a financial exodus. Her grandfather hadn't lost his fortune in bad trades or failed land deals. He had systematically relocated his wealth, converting liquid assets into untraceable forms and funneling them into the construction of this sanctuary. He wrote about the vultures in the family, specifically Mina's father and her siblings, and how their greed had become a sickness he could no longer tolerate. He had built this place not just to hide his money, but to hide his soul from the people who only saw him as a bank account. Mina felt a lump form in her throat as she read his final entry, dated just days before his passing. To the one who finds the map, the world sees what it expects to see. My children see a broken old man. I hope you see the truth. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The actual money, the millions the family thought had vanished into thin air, wasn't just a number in a ledger. It was here, somewhere in the bones of this invisible house. But as she looked around the pristine room, she realized the journals were only the beginning. The rusted key had opened the door, but it didn't fit the mystery of where the treasure truly lay. Mina's fingers traced the edge of the mahogany desk, her mind reeling from the weight of her grandfather's words. But the silence of the sanctuary was suddenly shattered by a sound that didn't belong in this deep wilderness. It was the low, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine, followed by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel far down the ridge. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she remembered a detail she had overlooked in her grief. Mark and Elena hadn't just mocked her at the party. They had been watching her. In a brief flashback, she recalled Mark's smug face as he leaned against his new sports car, his eyes darting to her phone on the stone patio. They had installed a tracking app on her device months ago, disguised as a family safety feature. To them, Mina was a liability, someone to be monitored and managed. They hadn't followed her out of love or concern. They had followed her out of a toxic mix of spite and curiosity, convinced that if the senile old man had left her anything, it was something they could legally claim. Back in the present, the engine cut out. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then came the sound of heavy boots. They were close, perhaps only 50 yards away, treading through the brush with the clumsy confidence of people who believed they owned the world. Mina stood frozen behind the one-way glass, watching as the foliage parted. Mark and Elena emerged into the clearing, looking wildly out of place in their designer outdoor gear. They were arguing, their voices muffled but the vitriol clear. They were looking for her car, for a trail, for anything that explained why she had disappeared into a wall of green. Mina realized with a jolt of adrenaline that this invisible cabin was her only fortress. However, she also knew the legal reality of their family. If they discovered the entrance, if they found a way to prove she was occupying land that hadn't been formally settled in probate, they would use every high-priced lawyer in the city to evict her. They would tear this masterpiece apart, looking for the gold they believed was buried in the dirt. The moral tension tightened around her chest. Part of her wanted to remain a ghost, to let them wander the woods until they gave up. But another part, the part that had been belittled for 40 years, wanted to stand her ground. She turned back to the desk, her eyes searching for a weapon or a shield. That was when she noticed a slight misalignment in the floorboards directly beneath the heavy desk. Dropping to her knees, she pulled back a corner of the hand-woven rug to reveal a small, recessed floor safe. It was made of reinforced steel, flush with the wood. Her pulse quickened. This had to be it. She pulled the rusted iron key from her pocket and tried to slide it into the lock, but her breath hitched in frustration. The key was too large. The wards were different. This was a second layer of security, a final gatekeeper. She was trapped in a house they couldn't see, holding a key that didn't work, while the people who had spent a lifetime crushing her spirit stood mere feet away.
The question wasn't just where the money went anymore. The question was whether she could unlock the second half of her inheritance before the vultures found the door. Mina's breath came in shallow hitches as the footsteps of her siblings vibrated through the very ground she knelt upon. The floor safe mocked her, its silver dial glinting in the amber light, while the rusted key sat useless in her palm. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the high-tech monitors to the relics of her grandfather's life. He was a man of layers. He never gave anything away for free. If the iron key opened the house, there had to be something else to open the heart of it. Her gaze fell on the nightstand near the small, cedar-framed bed. Resting there was his favorite old pocket watch, a heavy gold piece he had carried since the day he started his first business. She scrambled across the rug, her fingers fumbling with the watch's latch. It clicked open, revealing the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the internal gears. But nestled behind the glass face, where a photo of her grandmother used to be, was a tiny, intricate silver key. It was delicate, almost like a piece of jewelry. Mina didn't hesitate. She rushed back to the floor safe, her knees hitting the wood with a dull thud. She slid the silver key into the lock. It turned with a whisper-quiet click. As the heavy lid swung upward, Mina didn't find stacks of gold bars or bags of cash. Instead, she found a stack of thick, cream-colored envelopes and a series of original property deeds. Her hands trembled as she pulled the first document out. It wasn't for this cabin. It was the original deed to the family's primary estate, the mansion where Mark and Elena currently lived. She scanned the legal jargon, her eyes widening. The transfer of ownership to her father 30 years ago had never been legally finalized. There were missing signatures, unfiled affidavits, and a blatant trail of forged documents where her father had tried to bypass the probate process while the grandfather was still alive. A sudden shadow fell over the room. Mina looked up at the one-way glass. Mark and Elena were standing directly in front of her. They were so close she could see the sweat on Mark's brow and the sheer, ugly frustration in Elena's eyes. To them, they were looking at a dense wall of moss and a random oak tree. To Mina, she was watching the mask fall in real time. "She has to be around here somewhere," Mark spat, his voice muffled but audible through the reinforced glass. "When we find her, I'm calling the firm. We'll have her declared incompetent by Monday. She's clearly had a breakdown, wandering into the woods like this. We'll take the car, the accounts, everything. It's for her own good." Elena laughed, a sharp, cold sound that made Mina's skin crawl. "Her own good? I just want her out of my sight. She's always been a stain on the family name. Imagine, 40 years old, and she still thinks a rusted key is a birthday present." Mina sat on the floor, the deeds to their entire lives clutched in her hands. The realization washed over her like a cold wave. Her grandfather hadn't just given her a house. He had given her a detonator. He had known that one day, their greed would lead them right to her doorstep. He had waited 30 years to give her the power to unmake the empire they had built on lies. She wasn't the weak one anymore. She was the only one with the truth. Mina stood up, the cream-colored envelopes clutched tightly against her chest. The fear that had paralyzed her for the last hour evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, freezing clarity. She watched Mark kick at a pile of leaves, his face twisted in a mask of entitlement. He was standing less than 3 feet from the invisible door, completely unaware that the sister he despised was staring directly into his soul. Mina reached for the control panel beside the titanium frame. She didn't just want to hide anymore. She wanted them to see exactly what they had overlooked.
She pressed the manual override, and the magnetic seals disengaged with a hiss of pressurized air that sounded like a predator exhaling in the dark. Mark and Elena jumped back, their eyes bulging as a massive vertical slab of what they thought was a solid oak tree began to swing outward. To their perspective, the forest was literally tearing itself open. As the door cleared the frame, Mina stepped out from the climate-controlled shadows into the humid afternoon air. She didn't look like the broken woman who had fled the party in tears. She stood tall, silhouetted against the amber glow of the cabin's interior, appearing to materialize out of thin air, like a ghost reclaiming its haunt. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker. "Mina?" Elena stammered, her voice trembling as she clutched her designer bag. What is this? Where did you come from?" Mina didn't answer immediately. She let the weight of the moment settle over them. She watched the gears turn in Mark's head as he looked past her into the cabin. His eyes widened as he took in the mahogany furniture, the high-tech monitors, and the unmistakable aura of immense, hidden wealth. The greed was instantaneous. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to claim the space by touch. "Stay back," Mina said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a finality that stopped him mid-stride. "You've spent 40 years telling me I was worth nothing. You laughed when I took this key. You called Grandpa senile." She held up the leather-bound journal and the stack of deeds. "But he wasn't the one who lost his mind, Mark. He was the one who kept it. And he kept the receipts, too." She stepped forward, forcing them to retreat toward the muddy creek bed. "These aren't just papers. These are the original deeds to the estate in Potomac. The ones Dad forged. The ones that prove you've been living in a house that doesn't belong to you, on money that was stolen from a man who wanted nothing to do with you." The shift in power was physical. Mark's face went pale, the bravado draining out of him until he looked small and hollow. Elena began to shake, her eyes darting between the invisible house and the incriminating documents. The poor sister they had come to evict was now the only person standing between them and a total legal reckoning. Mina looked at the rusted key hanging from her hand. The irony was finally complete. They had traded a multi-million-dollar legacy for the temporary shine of luxury cars, while she had inherited the truth. Months have passed since that humid afternoon in the Maryland wilderness, and the world remains largely unaware of the miracle hidden behind the wall of glass and moss. Mina didn't use the forged deeds to cast her siblings into the street. Instead, she used them as a silent, unbreakable tether. She traded her silence for their total disappearance from her life, ensuring they would never again darken the door of the legacy they were too blind to appreciate. With the vultures finally gone, the cabin has transitioned from a lonely fortress into a living sanctuary. Mina realized that her grandfather hadn't just built a house, he had designed a blueprint for a different kind of existence. She has slowly opened the invisible doors to others who have been discarded by the same cold systems that nearly crushed her. The forest remains seemingly empty to the casual hiker or the distant satellite. The camouflage still holds, protected by the same meticulous engineering that kept her grandfather's heart safe for 30 years. But inside, the space is warm and full of purpose. Mina spends her mornings in the glow of the amber lights, studying the geothermal maps and solar grids that keep the sanctuary breathing. She has become the guardian of the unseen, a steward of a world that exists parallel to the one of marble foyers and Italian sports car keys. She often reflects on the true nature of value, how the most precious things in this life are often the ones that the world refuses to look at because they don't shine with a superficial gloss. She sits on the porch now, looking out through walls that aren't there. To the outside world, she is a ghost in a thicket. To herself, she has never been more visible. The rusted iron key, once a symbol of her family's scorn, has been polished until it gleams like dark silver. She wears it on a chain around her neck, a constant weight that reminds her of the day she turned 40 and finally found her way home. The irony of the cheap gift is a quiet joy she carries through the silent groves. Her siblings have their cars and their hollow titles, but Mina has the forest, the truth, and a house that defies the very laws of perception. She has learned that the greatest power isn't in owning the most, but in being the only one who knows where the treasure is actually buried. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the mirrored glass, she watches the light play over the moss, a silent witness to a miracle. The truth wasn't in the gold, but in the rare vision to see what others ignored. Mina finally understood that being invisible wasn't a curse. It was the ultimate freedom from the expectations of the greedy. If you believe everyone deserves a second chance at justice and a home that truly protects them, subscribe and join us for the next story. The forest is deep, but the truth always finds a way to the light.